All right, COM 400. This is the last part of the qualitative videos. We are looking at the last three kinds of qualitative research. We're going to look at intensive interviews, case studies, and also ethnography. Let's start with intensive interviews. These are longer and more in-depth than just personal interviews. There's a couple of characteristics. These may last several hours, quite long for as far as interviews go. They also may vary widely from the script. So you start with your protocol like you would in a focus group, but then the discussion may go far afield from that. They also may follow the participant's response, very much so. When I was in my early 20s, I read an article and it said, in regard to journalism interviews or even research interviews, the second question is more important than the first. And that's because depending on the respondent's response, the second question is going to be that you give is going to be based on that to get more in-depth information. Another aspect of intensive interviews is that fewer intensive interviews are usually done than you might expect. In something quantitative, you usually just have a small number and often less than 10. Usually 16 is the upper limit, but usually those are, you're doing them in depth, so you're actually doing fewer of those. Another aspect is that nonverbal responses are also recorded. So if somebody is, you ask a question and they don't say anything, you might include that there was a long pause, or you might include if they didn't say anything but they rolled their eyes. That would be very interesting in regard to the question. So those are some things in regard to intensive interviews. In regard to case studies, which is the next one, case studies uses as many data sources as possible. It may investigate individuals, groups, or organizations. In the case of organizations, if you're in business, sometimes they will investigate that to see how to make something better or find out what an organization is doing correctly so that others can copy it. It may involve advertising. It could involve public relations. It may focus on studying one store. It may focus on many stores. There is a variety of ways that can go. In case studies, though, lessons are learned that may apply to other cases. So you may go into a store and say, you study that, and you say, okay, because this store is doing this, let's do that for other places as well. So you're looking for tips, perhaps best practices, things like that you can apply to other things. Merriam lists 4 characteristics of case studies. So let's take a look at those 4. Not my thumb, but 4. I'm sticking out there. 4 characteristics of case studies. The first is that it is particularistic. Now, this means it studies a particular situation. It is looking at, let me give you an example. Perhaps we are going to study how grocery stores' reaction to the pandemic. So you might look at the way a particular grocery store, maybe a particular Kroger store, reacted and how they responded to the needs of the time. So that would be particularistic, and it makes it practical for understanding how something works. The second is descriptive. The final product is a detailed description of the topic based on the case. So you're taking the case and describing what is all of the aspects of that and what is going on in those situations. Another example of this would be with COVID-19. We're getting a lot of situations where people are studying individual cases to see, in some cases, how the virus spreads. Early on in China, they looked at different things and said, okay, this person, they thought it was didn't spread from person to person. And so they looked and said, wait a second. And there were some cases where people had not had any contact with or had not eaten certain things. And so they said, this obviously has been spread somehow, probably by you know, through the air, an airborne virus. So that would be one example of how descriptive case studies can help. It should also be a case study. Should also be heuristic, and you may hear that sometimes. You actually it comes up in articles and in news sometimes. Heuristic is kind of a big name for something that's easy to understand. It basically means it teaches. If something has heuristic value, it taught you something. So if somebody says, don't run your snowmobile on thin ice, and you do that and you fall in and you get cold and you get out and you say, that was heuristic, I learned not to do that. Or hopefully, maybe not. But that heuristic means that you've learned. And so through case studies, you can learn new interpretation. Let me start that over again. Take two, Dr. Banning talking. You can learn new interpretations, new perspectives, new meanings, and also fresh insights into how to approach something. And there are many cases with this COVID-19 where they have been doing that and saying, look what happened here. How did this, do we copy that? What do we actually learn from that? Did it teach us something? Was it heuristic? The fourth thing is that in these characteristics by Merriam, most case studies depend on inductive reasoning. And so when you're doing inductive reasoning, you're taking a small thing and making a generalization. And so generalizations can be made from the data. This is similar to what Sherlock Holmes used to do. In one of his books, he said, okay, here's a person who, he's talking to the person and he says, well, I can tell that you have a window on the left side of your bathroom. And so the person didn't understand how he could have figured that out. And the way was that half of his face was shaved better than the other, and he used that inductive reasoning. There's probably other reasons why half of your face might not be shaved, but for that story, it was a good example of inductive reasoning. The last kind of qualitative research that we're going to talk about, and that will end our discussion on qualitative research. The last is ethnography, and I really like this kind. Ethnography is a branch of anthropology, and it studies how people live their lives. And communication researchers have used it, and it is a good way of finding out lots of kinds of information. You might find out, look at people, how people interact with different kinds of media. You could look at ethnography of how somebody uses their cell phone throughout the day and find different kinds of people. You would probably find that a 14-year-old is using it differently than a 20-year-old, and they might use it much differently than somebody in their 60s. So an ethnography would see how people live their lives along with those things. It originally started, in fact, ethnography was originally called the Chicago School because a lot of people from Chicago started that. They began to look at different groups of people, and they wanted to learn the culture. One of the early ones was Native American cultures, and they wanted to see how they lived their lives and how just the different things that made each culture unique. They also went in places where people had not the Europeans hadn't gone, and they said, we want to learn about these cultures. And they didn't necessarily, those anthropologists didn't necessarily want civilization, that we call civilization, to go to those areas, but they wanted to study them. They saw each culture as kind of a jewel to be studied. So in ethnography, the researcher observes participants in their own environment. And sometimes advertisers will use this, where they will try to see how people use products at home and other places, and will study people doing this. News producers have been studied as well to see what influences them in how they might pick a story that's going to be published or put on the air. So we are going to end our discussion of qualitative research right there. I'll see you next week.